thanks everyone for coming today. Are we going to sit?
Yeah. Well,
okay.
I don't know if there's a formal way. I should have watched old Parkinson episodes to find out if there's a proper way of interviewing people. I'm sure there is.
I'm going to forget to hold this close to my mouth later, so you can tell me if I do.
Well, I've been a bit of a fan of your writing. Sorry to come over a bit gushy, but since the first Phaidon book, before I did a book, and I tell you what really struck me was that as I read the Phaidon, the first book, I thought this guy actually wants to teach people how to cook. There felt like you genuinely, and it comes across in the baking book as well, that you actually genuinely want people to succeed. And I don't know about other people listening, but I feel like a lot of chefs don't give a shit. They're just like, oh, yeah, it's the book. Yeah, I've got to do the book, you know. Nice photo, knock out a recipe that vaguely resembles. But you actually took time to cook things. Did that take you by surprise, or was that just you?
I mean, what took me most by surprise when I started writing books was that I actually enjoyed writing.
That comes across, yeah.
Yeah. No, and then I mean,
so
I think
before that you had.
No, I'd never written, you know, except in school and for other purposes. But and then I think that the wanting people to succeed just kind of sort of comes with the territory if you want to start producing books like the Nordic Cookbook and the Nordic Baking Book.
But it
otherwise, you won't be allowed to make more of them, I think.
Yeah. Do you another thing about an interesting thing I think is that you have a very small restaurant, and yet your book projects are very large in scale. Is there a bit of compensation going on for the?
Maybe there is, but I mean the fact that the restaurant is small also provides the opportunity to do other projects, regardless if it's book projects or you know various other things that I find interesting to work with. I think that if I had, like many other chefs do, 8 restaurants of various kinds in various parts of the world, it would be much harder, because then those would be the projects that you were actually working with, and it would be much harder to spend enough time to produce the research for books like the Nordic Cookbook and Baking Book.
Yeah. And how I mean, it scares the hell out of me, the idea of doing a comprehensive book. When I saw the Nordic Cookbook, I was like, oh my God, how does he do, you know, I can't even begin. In fact, there's a very famous episode of Blackadder. Do you know Blackadder?
I do.
There's a very famous episode where Dr. Johnson has just finished his English dictionary, and Blackadder says, starts making up words which obviously aren't in the book because he's making them up. Did you, when you finished these books, suddenly go, oh, I forgot the most obvious? Yeah. Does that happen?
It does.
I'm relieved.
No, and the thing is that the first thing that happens when you tell, like for example on Instagram, if you post like I did yesterday that now the book is being released and I'm very happy with it. So the first thing that happens, the first thing that happens is actually that you get some likes and people, you know, being happy. But then the second thing that happens is that you get a lot of direct messages where people are like trying to make sure that their particular specialty is represented in the book, and then most of the time it's not. Because the fact is that there is a limited amount of space in a book like this, and I mean both of these books are documentary, and the goal is to represent as many people as well as possible, which in a way means that you're going to represent everyone kind of poorly.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I see what you mean.
You know, because otherwise it would be 10 books like that in a big box.
Yeah.
And, you know, it would be difficult to
so there's a balance
for Amazon to ship it, I think.
You're constantly striking a balance.
Yeah.
Between, do you find that you have a lot of material left, or do you just not travel down certain roads?
No, I mean, there is a lot of material left for sure, and a lot of the material that also came into this book, I produced during the research for the Nordic Cookbook, and it just could not fit in there. Yeah. But and then we also add. I mean, we've added between print runs for the Nordic Cookbook, for example, we did add recipes that were missing where there were a bit of space. You know, And I think I really do hope also that these books will keep being revised over time, and because the goal with them was also to show what people actually eat now, not just to make a historical document of what people used to eat but never cook anymore.
So across
and that's important to keep.
Social history?
Yeah, I don't know. Just
Sorry, I studied history, so these labels
I didn't.
matter to me. So folk history would be, you know, there would be less need for evidence. There would be less need, because I notice in it, you think sometimes, like a historian, you kind
I mean, and this is all. Both of these books are all the material is reviewed academically by Richard Tellström, who's an associate professor in anthropology.
Yeah.
So it should be fairly correct.
Yeah, I mean, it seems so, and just the way that you approach all the different things.
Mm.
One of the things that surprised me, and I don't know, most people in here are English, I think. Now, I was a young baker, so at the age of 16, 17, in Whitstable, in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, I couldn't get hold of fresh yeast anywhere. In fact, I realised that it would be easier to buy drugs in Whitstable. I could get hold, if you wanted some hash when you came to Whitstable, I could have got that for you.
That's still the case in the US, actually, with the yeast.
Yeah,
it
well,
is.
yeah. It shows priorities, doesn't it? The Anglo-Saxon priorities. And so, actually, scoring some yeast was difficult. I had to go, and strangely, it might have seemed like I was buying something else. I used to have to go to the back door of a bakery very late at night or very early in the morning, and there was a Rastafarian baker who used to listen to amazing dub reggae, and we got to know him, and we'd stop by the back door, and I'd get my small lump of yeast.
Yeah.
And that was how I started cooking. And when I was 16, I got all my friends back to my house, baked some bread rolls, put a wedge of butter in each one, and said, "Isn't it amazing?" You know, and that was my kind of beginning of baking. What I noticed in the book was that Scandinavia, yeast is available everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that says a lot about the Scandinavian, like the importance of baking in the Scandinavians or in the whole Nordic region, actually. Because yeast is, I mean, there is not a single grocery store, there is not a convenience store, there's not a newspaper kiosk that doesn't have fresh yeast.
Yeah,
you know, you can
well,
get
that
it
is
anytime,
amazing.
everywhere.
See, that just isn't the case.
And you can also see, like in the recipes in the book, that they're all adapted to the standard, you know, sale measurement of fresh yeast in the Nordics, which is 50 grams.
Yeah.
So they sort of started with that and then just built the recipes from
50
there.
grams, which is 2 ounces, which is the same as ours.
Yeah.
So I would always get like 2 ounces. But that, to me, tells a story. You know, the availability of fresh yeast tells me that simple fact says to me that you lot care in Sweden, Denmark, Finland and Norway, you care more about baking than we do in England.
Or we just discovered dry yeast much later. Could be that as well.
Well, I did think about that, and I remembered when dry yeast kind of turned up.
Yeah,
as
I do
kind
too,
of,
actually.
Yeah, as kind of being available, and I did try it, normally for just pizzas or things like that, but it was never as good.
Yeah, no, I remember that as well, and I remember my dad was very excited about this dry yeast, so you didn't have to keep your fresh yeast all the time in the fridge.
Yeah.
And then they used it for a while, very excited about the novelty of the whole thing, and then slowly it just disappeared again.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, which is exactly what happened with me. You know, I would bother to go, and then, as I say, you'd go to the bakers in England, and they would look at you suspiciously, like, well, why you want to bake bread? You know, as if I don't know. It's like trying to buy citric acid in a chemist. I mean, whenever I go into I now buy it from restaurant stores, but they just assume you're making a bomb. I think. I was impressed by that in Scandinavia. The other thing that struck me about Scandinavian cooking, slightly wider than even baking, is the spicing. Yeah. It fascinates me. Now, in England, I was saying to you, ginger, mace, cloves, there are certain spices that, and in fact, if you go to Heston's dinner, all of his spicing is this old English spicing, and it's very clever and very subtle. Scandinavia, the spicing is completely different. It's
completely different, but it's kind of the same also, because it's there for the same reasons historically. I mean, you had your East Indian Company, we also had one. Yeah. They did the same thing, which was importing a lot of things, among them spices. Yeah. So you'll find a lot of sweet spices in not just this sort of traditional Scandinavian, not Nordic baking, but Scandinavian from the Three Kingdoms. You'll definitely find sweet spices almost everywhere, and also in the traditional cooking. And I think that the reason why I mean, you told me earlier that it was ginger, mace, and
that's what I think of
more.
as the English classic origins. Yours is cardamom.
Yeah, so Sweden is the biggest consumer of cardamom per capita in the world, actually.
Yeah,
it's because of the buns.
Is it just the buns?
Yeah, there's a lot of cardamom in the buns. No, and I think it's just the reason why the flavor profiles are a bit different is that people just preferred different spices and stuck to them, and it became culture, and now it's tradition. Because we had access to virtually the same palette to start with.
Okay. Yeah.
The trade routes were very similar. The products that they traded with and brought with them back were very similar. I mean, that's the reason why you'll find also ginger and cloves and nutmeg and things in Swedish cooking as well. Lots of dried bitter orange peel, for example. I mean, not many bitter oranges that grow in Sweden, for sure.
No, they're from the West Indies, probably, aren't they? Yeah, that's interesting. And caraway. I never got caraway.
No, me neither.
No.
It's strange, huh?
Yeah, I mean,
we put it in everything, you know.
But when I go to Sweden, caraway's in everything.
It is.
Seems to be.
Yeah, no, it's so you can go to the same supermarket that sells you the fresh yeast. They will also sell you the standard bread seasoning mix, which is going to be caraway, aniseed, and
what, in sachets?
Cumin. Yeah, in sachets, pre-ground, sort of. And I've never been a fan of caraway either, and it's in everything. I see, like it's in cheese, it's in the aquavit, it's in breads, it's everywhere.
I think of it almost as the taste of Sweden, because I
like that cheese with the caraway, and
exactly
that I can tolerate.
Yeah,
but
I think
it's
maybe
like
the saltiness of it is what helps.
But for my breads, I prefer to put fennel and aniseed.
Okay.
Maybe coriander seed as well.
Yeah. So a couple of I need to ask this myself. I've got to, Emma, my partner, has roped me into the school fair, and I've got to bake 40 or 50 buns, which, is it right, bread rolls that they put turkey and everything in. I want a recipe from the book that I should use. Which one should I use?
I think you want something that's sort of this size?
Just kind of, fist. Yeah,
there is one that's called rosenbröd, which is it's like I had them. I mean, it's not a very old recipe or anything, but I had them growing up in the 80s. Yeah, it's white flour, quite a lot of milk, and then a bit of sugar and no seasoning in the dough. Yeast, and it's a very quick fermentation. You'll do like 50 grams of yeast for half a liter of milk. So it'll rise in 30 minutes. Right. And you make little buns, you brush them with egg wash, and then you sprinkle quite a lot of poppy seed on top.
Oh,
and they're very tasty.
Yes, love the poppy seed. Yeah. And also, I mean, you even this is an example of a man who actually wants you to succeed, which I say is rare in food cookery writing. Or chefs, sorry, I should say chefs cookery writing. You even explain how to egg wash.
Yeah, but I mean, how often do you get a good egg wash?
Well, I know. I mean, of course,
it's exceedingly rare.
I've seen that, but
it's like eating brown plastic when
it's poorly done. And the trick is to get a big bowl, get the egg yolk, whisk it, and then add the milk and whisk it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to get rid of the lumps. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
but I mean, very often, both in professional bakeries and when people bake at home, it's like the egg wash has lumps of egg white in it, and it's also too much of it.
Yes.
So you get this sort of brown, plasticky thing hanging off the bun, which is not particularly nice.
Rather than just the glossy shine that you want. But that's what I mean, little tips like that. But I love that because
it's cross-referenced from every recipe that has egg wash in the whole book, I think.
Yes, so useful skill to learn if you're going to use the book. And the other thing another observation was there's one chapter where you have a small rant which you allow yourself about.
I warned for it before as well.
About the curse of the artisan types who want to make sourdough everything and wholemeal everything, and they're rather dogmatic, whereas you clearly show a more thought-through approach. Can you explain that?
I like a great sourdough loaf for what it is.
Yeah, of course.
But this particular rant was that I do not want sourdough in my buns, in my sweet cardamom buns, because it is not tasty.
Why is that? I mean, I know the answer, but I'm interested to
but the thing is that and this is something that I thought a lot about writing both of these books, actually, is that there is no such thing as good and bad food culture. It's only food culture. And that's something that, as a chef and as a person who has often strong opinions on what's good and bad when it comes to food, it's a bit of a conflict. And it's just, as soon as you start judging food culture, if you're making a documentary book, then it's no longer going to be documentary. And one of those things that I really felt was with the bakers, there's been this movement of, better bread, which is great. I mean, we have many more good bakeries now than we had that, use good flour and they use sourdoughs and they bake bread the proper way. But that doesn't mean that, like those buns that I told you about before, with 50 grams of yeast per 5 deciliters of milk and like the processed white flour. That doesn't make that less important as a cultural.
Yeah, white flour's been with us for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and the thing is with all of these things is that there is no better or less good. It's just different. Yeah. And with the buns, for example, what I want from a bun is I want to have like the sweetness of wheat. I want to have the flavor of yeast being cooked, and I want to have that sort of delicate texture that you can only get from white flour and yeast. So and the reason for that is that it is like a great bun. It's about a delicate balance. You don't want it to be too sweet. You don't want it to be too fatty. You don't want it to be heavy. You want it to be like light and fluffy and delicate and beautiful. And if you make the sourdough bun with a long leavening time, not only will you lose out on all of that wheaty sweetness, because that disappears with the lactic fermentation of the dough, you will also get a different texture that will inevitably be more compact. And because you add acidity, you're also going to have to add more sugar to make it taste balanced. So it's going to be sweeter, it's going to be heavier, and it's just not going to be a great bun. And when you do that, you tend to also put too much seasoning in. So there's going to be too much of the cardamom. It's going to be like all crunchy when you eat it, And I think that is like, people should just make the buns they used to be.
Yeah.
No sourdough buns.
Yeah. No, I loved it because there is an assumption things take over. Sourdough is seen as the only way to bake.
Yeah. There are many ways, and there are many ways. And in the same way as I prefer any day like a great sourdough loaf made from whole wheat to like one made from processed flour and yeast for my sandwich. I'll take the bun with the processed flour and the yeast any day over the sourdough bun. Just different things,
Well, the English contribution to this debate would be the bread used for a bacon sandwich. See, most people insist on processed white bread. By the way, we are responsible, Britain, for the Chorleywood process. Those loaves, Hovis loaves and others, that are square and white, and you break them up and you squeeze them and they just become a ball. Well, that was the Chorleywood process, which you obviously know about, which was 1961, was invented in England as a way of turning flour into bread within 3 hours. And so very, very high. It was also using soft, less glutinous flour and finding a way of using it to produce bread. And it was really a reaction, I think, to the Second World War and food security, which is becoming an issue again now, 55 years later or whatever. Food security is becoming an issue. But yeah, in England, it's the bacon sandwich, because the white bread, the processed white bread, allows you to taste the bacon and the tomato ketchup more. Whereas if you make it with kind of, a beautiful sourdough loaf, you just can't taste the ketchup and the butter and the bacon so much. And so that's the closest we can get to joining with you.
But it's the same. It's exactly the same thing, and it's like, you as a personal opinion, you can decide that you like one more than the other. But as a cultural occurrence, none of them is better than the other. I mean, they are equally.
Both need to be documented, which is what you've done. And it's noticeable, all the chapters that, you can go in there. So if you say, I fancy making some cinnamon buns, there's how many? 5, 6?
I think there are 5 or 6 basic recipes, and then there are maybe 15 or 20 variations, and then another 15 or 20 shapes that you can use. and you can multiply them. So.
Yeah, and that's one of the great things about
it. And that's actually one of the big key differences between because there's baking in the Nordic Cookbook as well, and that's the key difference because the bun section in the Nordic Cookbook, it has one recipe and it has 2 fillings and it has maybe 3 sort of shapes. Right. Because we couldn't fit more in there. Sure. Whilst in this one.
Hence why you did it. Which brings me on really to the last question, which is what do you what's next? I mean, I know you've got a tour of the world, first of all. Yeah. This man goes on world tours. I went to Norwich, I think, or something like that. But he goes to New York. Nothing wrong with Norwich, no, nothing. Great football team. But after your world tour, or first of all, the world tour, are you looking forward to that?
I do. I mean, and that's I enjoy. I mean, this is the end of a 6-year project.
Of course,
and I enjoy meeting people and talking about it, and hopefully seeing them appreciate, the book as such and the work that's gone into it. Yeah. So I look forward to that, and then after that, I mean, I will mostly be at Phaidon and at home. And then I've also just very recently bought an orchard, which is essentially a vacation home with a lot more work attached to it.
So your vacations are now going to be spent making cider?
Yeah, it has 10,000 apple trees.
10,000? Yeah. What does that produce in total? Do you know roughly what?
250 tons.
250 tons. You'll have to get one of those huge presses. Are you on the lookout for them, or are you going to go?
Not currently.
No,
because I have no more money to buy anything with.
I got offered one, which was about 10 years ago, which was where you screw this thing. But what happens is that the apples get mushed up, and then I think you ferment them when they're mushed, and then you press them, which I think was an English method of making cider.
I have no idea.
Yeah. Well,
this might be the next research project.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it. But so, book-wise, I mean, this is like a trilogy, isn't it? It's like the end of Star Wars, you start with Phaidon, onto the Nordic Cookbook, which is like The Empire Strikes Back, because it's big and massive and such a big project. Yeah. And this ties it up really neatly. So what's the... you haven't... I mean, you've documented Nordic food, which I guess is about more than most people do in their lifetime. So hang up the pen, but I get the feeling you've got a lot to say.
Yeah, I mean, there will definitely be more books coming. I mean, I really do enjoy writing, and I mean, the Nordic Cookbook did really well, and I hope this one will do well too, which is sort of an important factor if you're going to be allowed to continue writing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no, of course, yeah. But there's no doubt with this one. I mean, in many ways, I'd choose this one for my kitchen, because I was just saying that above an awful lot of other books, because that book will be stained with all sorts of jam and dough and everything, because it's such a user-friendly book. The recipes are really... the recipes are not intimidating at all. And as I say...
they are a snapshot of what people actually bake at home in
but that's
Sweden,
what I mean,
Norway,
because of
and
the
everywhere
availability
today.
of yeast. You've got a folk baking culture. Ours is just this made-up thing for a television programme, the Great British Bake Off. There's no roots to it. Our roots are maybe the Women's Institute and being able to buy, them having fairs and being able to buy their jam tarts and cakes and things. And there's not really like you've got in Sweden, and that's the amazing thing I found about the yeast, which I think is really the clincher.
Maybe I think it might have to do with geographical distribution as well. Yeah. Because you will surely have more bakeries here per capita than we would have in Sweden because of a denser population. Yeah. Like more cities and towns. Yeah. Which is, I mean, if you think about many of the breads that you can buy, they are entirely reliant on bakeries to exist because they're impractical to bake at home. I mean, who bakes a loaf of bread every morning at home? Very few people. Whilst in large parts of Scandinavia, I mean, there is just not enough people to sustain a bakery, which has led to people baking more at home. And even though today you don't really need to do that anymore, I think that still lives on as a tradition. Yeah.
And enables you to write a book like that. I'm curious simply because Elizabeth David wrote a book. Did you look at that at all? English Bread and Yeast Cookery.
I did not.
No, well, she... I feel like Blackadder now. You mean you didn't read... Anyway, don't worry about it, but I noticed one thing in common, which is that you both mentioned pizzas. which was interesting because we talked about pizzas last night.
Yeah.
We're not allowed to talk. Fiona has banned the talk of pizzas.
Pizzas are not Italian, huh?
Yeah. And Magnus has got some great theories about it, but apparently not for here and now.
No.
But
they're not academically verified.
But Elizabeth David's English bread and yeast cookery is the closest we come to that. And hers is very interesting. You know, I just read it before your book turned up. So that's why I was just thinking, oh, that's interesting. But because I was thinking, how would somebody document English food baking culture? And she's done that, and it's all historical. There's
And
very
when
little
was it
feeling
produced?
of it being folk. Well, she wrote it in 1970, I think.
Yeah. Maybe it's a time to do it again then.
Well, exactly, yeah. Yeah, maybe that's why, yeah. No, because I'd forget something like, I don't know, scones. Do you know what I mean? And I'd have nightmares. I wouldn't be able to sleep. So I'm not kitted out to do this. But you are, and the book is fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thanks for coming.